The sky that evening was the color of iron, heavy with a storm that seemed eager to make the mountains its stage. Rain started as a fine mist, then thickened into hammering sheets against the steel gate at the bottom of the ridge. I had already prepared for this, of course. The gate was my first renovation, reinforced with steel posts, welded crossbars, and a lock system designed to withstand a ramming truck. I knew as soon as I saw headlights multiplying below on the camera feed that the showdown I had been anticipating for weeks was finally here. Karen had chosen her moment. A storm rolling in, a moving truck angled across the road, her elderly parents in tow, and herself stepping out like a general marshalling her troops. The absurdity of it almost rivaled the thunder shaking the trees. The U-Haul rocked and spun its wheels in the thickening mud, painting the scene with chaos before anyone even said a word. Beside it, Karen's parents sat pale and confused in the back seat of a small sedan, their faces caught like deer in the relentless glare of the truck lights. Behind them, the sheriff's SUV idled with its patrol lights streaking red and blue across rain-slick bark, slicing the shadows into frantic fragments. Time trembled in that uneasy stillness before Karen's voice broke the storm. She screamed at me to open the gate, her words shredded by thunder that rolled like cannon fire along the ridge. I stood calmly on my side of the barrier, rain soaking through my jacket, the key to the lock dangling from my hand like bait she would never receive. Her fury was volcanic, fueled less by reason than by the conviction she had carried for months, that my land was somehow hers to command, that tradition and entitlement outweighed deeds and survey maps. She pointed not just at me but toward the truck and her parents, framing me as a villain who denied shelter to the vulnerable. Her voice cracked with the force of her righteousness, insisting the gate had to be opened in the name of emergency and family rights. But the storm itself seemed to agree with me, not her. Rain spilled through rivulets down the chained posts. Thunder punctuated my silence, and the heavy lock gleamed like a verdict. The sheriff's presence was a silent weight pressing down on the moment. He did not rush to her aid but sat first in his vehicle watching. He had seen her before, of course, seen the nuisance filings, the fake bylaws, the petty harassment disguised as civic duty. When he stepped from the SUV at last, pulling his hood over his head, it was with the weary posture of a man walking into a farce he had already memorized. He told her quietly but firmly that this road was private, that she had been warned, that she and her caravan needed to turn around before the weather trapped them in mud. His refusal to indulge her tantrum drained the last illusion of control from the scene. For me, the drama unfolded in electric layers, her parents peering out wide-eyed from behind fogged glass, beginning to recognize they had been misled into believing this was their rightful return. The driver of the U-Haul, caught in the crossfire of someone else's obsession, muttering about the risk of losing his truck to a landslide. And Karen herself, hair plastered to her forehead, eyes wild with disbelief that bureaucracy and theatrics no longer bent to her will. She clung to the fantasy, shouting about ancestral rights and legal tricks, but her words drowned in the roar of the storm. The sheriff asked almost perfunctorily if I wished to press charges there and then, but I shook my head. I didn't need vengeance. I needed the road cleared and the absurd spectacle ended. As lightning split the ridge and thunder boomed directly overhead, her parents finally raised their voices, not against me, but against her. Their muffled tones carried desperation, frustration, perhaps even betrayal. They wanted to leave, to abandon this rain-slick circus before disaster struck. The U-Haul driver reading the room revved the engine and began the cautious retreat downhill, tires skidding before catching traction. One by one, the vehicles turned, headlights glinting in the pouring rain like a caravan of ghosts receding into mist. Karen lingered, shouting that the fight was not over, but even her voice weakened under the storm's command. The sheriff's gentle hand on her shoulder broke the last of the play. And so there I stood alone at the gate, rain pounding on metal, thunder fading into the distance. The storm had won the argument I never had to finish. The lock was cold and solid in my palm, the chain taut with finality. It was not victory marked by cheers or gloating, but by something quieter, a profound calm. The siege long prepared for had been endured not by retaliation but by simple, immovable refusal. I climbed the path back up to the house, my boots sinking into mud, my jacket dripping with defiance and rain. Amid the storm's fury, the mountain house glowed dimly through the mist. every new board and nail catching the rain like a banner, whispering the same truth the sheriff and the storm had conspired to show. The line had been drawn. The gate had held, and Karen's fantasy dissolved into the wet night. 2 months before the storm in the U-Haul, before the sheriff's lights flickered through the rain, my battle with Karen began in a very different setting. In the quiet, almost magical discovery of an abandoned mountain house I thought would become my sanctuary. I had come up the winding road in a rented pickup, following nothing but a crumpled paper map, and the stubborn hope that somewhere out there, hidden from the grid of plotted cul-de-sacs and humming suburbs, a secret escape still waited. What I found looked at first like nothing more than ruin. A roof sagging under rain-dark shingles, windows shuttered and broken, the surrounding land untamed as if no hand had managed it for decades. But the longer I stood and stared, the more I felt that low stirring you get when possibility thrums just beneath layers of decay. It would need sweat, patience, and lumber, lots of both. But it radiated the sense that it had one more life in it. A crooked "for sale by owner" sign nailed to a leaning pine marked the final invitation. I called the number, met an old logger who sold it to me for cash, shrugged that the road was whoever lives at the end's problem, and sent me away with a folder full of deeds and survey maps like relics of a forgotten dynasty. In that first week, I was enchanted. The mornings came tinged with mist curling low through the trees. The valley below hushed, and I walked the property like a solitary king returned to his neglected realm. I imagined myself replacing floorboards, patching walls, reviving the porch steps. This would be where noise melted away, where I worked slowly and quietly, restoring something old without interruption. That fantasy lasted exactly 7 days, until Karen appeared. The first meeting was almost comical. I was driving back toward the ridge after hauling up supplies, mind heavy with plans for plumbing and light fixtures, when I saw her standing in the road. Clipboard in one hand, the other raised like a traffic cop, she waved me down with the certainty of a person who had spent far too long rehearsing the gesture. She didn't wait for me to roll down the window completely before announcing herself. President of the association, steward of community rules, enforcer of votes on renovations, parking, and even who could spend the night. The words fell with the officious sting of someone drunk on invented parliament. For a moment I thought she must be joking, that no one could claim dominion over a forgotten cabin carved into a private ridge. But she pointed dutifully at a fading wooden sign nailed to a nearby tree. Mountain Community, letters worn away by time, and puffed herself up as though it were the Constitution itself. I showed her the deed casually through the glass, the ink still strong, the surveyor's note still crisp. She snorted in disdain, like paperwork was a weak excuse against her clipboard. She added, almost as an afterthought, that the previous owner had generously allowed her parents to stay whenever they needed. According to Karen, this was tradition. I smiled politely, because what else do you do when someone draws their authority from imaginary traditions? And eased the truck forward until she had no choice but to step away. In that moment, I chalked her up as eccentric, the kind of neighbor you deal with by nodding and avoiding eye contact. But eccentricity revealed itself as something darker within weeks. Each supply run was greeted with her car parked deliberately at the bend, her phone flashing as she filmed my deliveries. I'd find handwritten notes tucked under my windshield wipers citing quiet hours and landscape harmony, as though I were suddenly boarding at her bed and breakfast. Contractors began telling me about a woman with sharp eyes intercepting them at the bottom of the road. Warning of permits and ongoing litigation. One afternoon, bold as brass, she stepped right onto the property and prowled around the cabin, declaring the guest house had historically been communal shelter. It was intrusion disguised as inspection, and in that instant it was clear she saw herself not as my neighbor, but as self-appointed gatekeeper to the ridge. That night, I sat surrounded by the old logger's folder of land documents, reading them through with new attention. There, in ink faded but legible, was the affirmation I needed. The road was private, the gate and land exclusively deeded to the final parcel, no community easements anywhere on record. Tucked in the back, a letter from a surveyor decades past confirmed what the deed already implied, that the road was mine to maintain, mine to allow, mine to deny. The discovery struck like steel clicking into place. I understood then why the relic of a gate at the bottom mattered so much. Its rusted hinges were more than neglected hardware. They were the line between private retreat and chaos. So I made the gate my first project, replacing the posts, welding new brackets, securing a lock system that hummed with finality when it snapped shut. As I worked, hauling debris, patching walls, pushing light back into broken rooms, I imagined Karen watching from her bend in the road, clipboard impotent, campaign unraveling against the clang of a galvanized chain. For those early weeks of sweat and sawdust, everything clicked into rhythm. The mountain house began to breathe again. Its bones warmed under my hands, and yet with each board nailed down, I knew her shadow would return. Karen's clipboard and contrived rights were no eccentric accident. They were the opening volley of something far messier simmering ahead. By the second month, what had started as irritation had transformed into something resembling a low-grade war. Karen was no longer content with waving her clipboard in the road or muttering about bylaws of her own invention. The battle escalated into petty manipulations, whispers to contractors, and a flood of paperwork designed to make my quiet renovation feel less like carpentry and more like fighting a legal campaign. Every time I thought I might settle into the rhythm of building, sawing beams, patching walls, coaxing the old house back into life, Karen's shadow appeared to sour the day. The project I had dreamed of as a sanctuary was steadily morphing into a fortress under siege. Her tactics had range. I'll give her that. Some days she played the bureaucrat, leaving notes about noise ordinances and quiet hours written in the officious tone of a judge no one had elected. Other days she acted like an outlaw inspector, filming construction and barking at hired contractors as though she had the county seal sewn into her sleeve. The strangest escalation came when she produced a packet of association bylaws, typed on flimsy printer paper, unsigned, unfiled, and clearly written at a kitchen table between cups of herbal tea. She pressed them into my hand with theatrical weight, as though a document without signatures had the force of law. I took a careful photo, handed them back, and smiled politely, which only sharpened the edge in her eyes. It didn't stop there. She began using contractors and delivery drivers as pawns in her game. A lumber truck arrived at the bottom of the road one morning, idle for hours until the driver finally told me that a woman claiming to be association president had intercepted him to warn that the road was about to be condemned. Another builder told me she had declared the guest house an unlicensed boarding facility and hinted that working with me could land him on record. It might have worked if the county didn't know her too well already. One inspector who came because of her complaint shook his head, scribbled no cause, and muttered, "She files on somebody every single month." Even bureaucracy, her favorite weapon, was beginning to fail her. Still, she doubled her pressure with rumors, spreading stories in town that I was some out-of-state squatter scheming to develop the ridge into a private resort. At the hardware store, a man I barely knew asked if it was true I was going to bulldoze hunting lands. The lie crumbled when I pulled out my deed, paperwork highlighted and laminated like a holy relic, but it made clear that Karen was willing to smear rather than yield. It was neighborliness turned into propaganda. I realized then that brute denial would never be enough. I needed to outmaneuver her with facts and patience, so I began documenting everything. Every call, every visit, every voicemail with her cutting voice, every photo of her car parked at the bend. I logged in a small notebook I carried in my back pocket. My evenings were spent uploading footage from new gate cameras, scanning county records, and filing neat, orderly folders my lawyer told me to keep ready. What was once a personal retreat had become a chess game, and I intended to hold the center. But as ugly as it was, the escalation also sharpened me. Contractors who initially hesitated began to see through Karen's act and laughed at her warnings. One even brought me a recording of her berating him at the road, claiming I was squatting. We played it back over coffee and chuckled, and with that, he doubled his commitment to the job. The county clerk started calling me directly to flag each of her filings before they reached a hearing. Even the sheriff, when I crossed paths with him in town, gave me a wry smile and said, "She's been at it again, hasn't she?" handing me his card without asking for details. Without Karen realizing it, each move she played alienated another ally and stitched others closer to me. Meanwhile, the renovations pressed forward. By day I hammered, sawed, wired, and painted, reviving rooms that had long since given up their fight against neglect. By night I fortified the perimeter, upgrading locks and welding reinforcements on the gate until it stood like an iron rebuke to the fantasy she projected. Standing in sawdust with a nail gun and then reviewing legal statutes with a flashlight became my rhythm. Construction and countermeasure. Creation and defense. The true absurdity of it all was how Karen shifted between roles depending on her audience. To me, she was the tyrant, fist clenched, voice sharp as a crow in winter winds. To contractors, she played savior of the ridge, manufacturing myths about community heritage. To the county, she became victim, claiming her parents had been denied sanctuary in their ancestral cabin. But every mask slipped eventually, and the cumulative effect was that people began to tire of her theater. Word spread that Karen's at it again, and not with admiration. By the time summer rolled across the ridge, the lines were clearly drawn. My mountain house had begun to resemble exactly what she feared. A fortress both practical and symbolic, not because I'd planned for it, but because her attacks demanded it. She wanted community compliance, and what she won instead was isolation. She had thought she could drown me in paperwork, rumors, and intimidation, but all she'd done was teach me discipline, to keep records, to set boundaries, to weld my gate shut with both steel and resolve. The escalation phase ended not with gunfire or trespassing, but with a psychological shift. Karen still hovered, still harassed, still whispered, but the weapons she wielded no longer cut. Each new rumor collapsed faster. Each new inspection ended with a shrug. My patience had grown tougher than her persistence. And though the siege continued, something in its balance had shifted. The mountain and the house had become not just projects, but proofs, and I had become harder to move than the iron posts sunk deep into the road. By late summer, Karen had shifted her tactics. The skirmishes about noise, trucks, and community votes were no longer enough for her. She had tired of scribbling notes for my windshield and filing nuisance complaints that the county inspectors laughed off in 5 minutes. Now she sharpened her war into something more cunning: legal filings and moral posturing, a twin assault of bureaucracy and guilt. It wasn't about the gate anymore. It was about trying to thread her parents into the fabric of my property, weaving them as evidence in a story where I was not a homeowner, but a landlord of obligations. And she wielded her strategy with grim conviction. It began with her plea about elderly parents needing temporary shelter. She arrived one morning at the gate, hair neatly styled, tone perfectly rehearsed, holding her parents' fragility like a spear. From the other side of the steel lock, she called up to me that her parents had lost their apartment, that they needed the cabin just for a month. She infused every word with trembling urgency, making it sound less like a request and more like a moral command. "We're talking about elderly people here," she insisted, eyes darting up to the camera I had mounted above the lock. She knew she was being recorded. She wanted the footage to look like compassion versus cruelty. I had expected this kind of attempt, and I responded with calm refusal. Not loud, not defensive, just steady. "The guest house is private property," I said. "Your parents are not permitted to stay." Her jaw tightened, the practiced sympathy cracked, and anger rushed back to the surface as she pointed accusingly at the re-roofed guest house shimmering in the sun. "Why fix it," she shouted, "if not for guests?" Her words tried to sound righteous but rang hollow in the pine-filled air. She spun away in a storm of gravel and shouts promising a complaint. True to her word, 2 days later, an inspector trudged onto the property unannounced, clipboard in hand. I could see the hesitation in his eyes the moment he introduced himself. Karen had filed another unsafe conditions report. He dutifully poked around, checked beams and wiring, then handed me a clean report and sighed. "She files on everybody," he admitted. Then he lowered his voice, almost as if confessing a town secret, and told me that she had recently attempted to designate my guest house as a community emergency shelter. Her petition to the county had failed, but barely. Hearing that jolted me. I realized that her war was no longer just harassment. It was doctrine. She wanted to rewrite the legal story of my land until it wore her family name. My lawyer became my shield. I sent him every scrap of paper, every notice, every voicemail laced with Karen's self-justifying tone. He drafted cease and desist letters that landed with the weight of polished authority, filed counter-statements to her petitions before they reached a hearing, and reminded me to document everything. "She's building a narrative," the sheriff had said earlier. Now I saw it. She wasn't flailing anymore, she was plotting. If she could frame me as the heartless new owner who barred frail elders from access, she might bend public sympathy to her favor, even if law proved her wrong. This was no longer a fight at the gate. It was a battle for perception. The strategies turned stranger. One evening, I found a man at the diner repeating her newest claim, that I was running a private resort in secret, planning to drive out longtime locals. The story had all her fingerprints, grandiose, paranoid, but delivered with an air of hometown righteousness. People repeated it because it made for drama. Yet when I showed this man my deed and renovation notes, the lie fell apart in seconds. But I recognized her method. She was building not with walls and bricks, but with whispers and doubts. In response, I built differently too. I reinforced the guest house doors with a heavy deadbolt and locked away the keys. I added more cameras, each uploading footage automatically to the cloud. I started stocking supplies, redundancies of food and fuel, because her interference in my deliveries proved she might escalate again. She wanted to erode my ability to live comfortably up here. I denied her that weapon. My vigil grew more methodical. Perimeter walks by flashlight each evening, notes scribbled in my back pocket ledger, video files doubled up and dated. It was exhausting but oddly satisfying, like sharpening a blade against her constant grinding attempts. Yet beneath the absurdity, I sometimes felt a flicker of pity. Her parents were not villains in this saga. They looked bewildered in the one moment they'd been present, sitting pale in the U-Haul. I doubted they understood the fantasy Karen had sold them. The paper kingdom she insisted was their right. They were pawns in her legal myth-making, and part of me resented her more for that than for the harassment itself. The truth, however, is that her strategy backfired. The more she spun fantastical filings, the more local officials began to tire of her. The county clerk, who once treated me as just another new property owner, began proactively calling me when Karen filed something, just to give you a heads up. Contractors, once hesitant, grew loyal after realizing her threats were empty. Even the sheriff began shaking his head with familiarity each time her name was raised. Karen thought she was laying siege with signatures and petitions, but in reality she was eroding her own credibility. Paper by paper, the legal and psychological warfare taught me as much as it frustrated me. It hardened my patience into something weapon-like. By the time summer shadows grew long across the ridge, I had learned not to flinch at her notes or threats, not to strain against her accusations, but to live steadily within facts and evidence. Every filing ended in rejection, every rumor dissolved under light, and every confrontation built my resolve. Karen desired to turn my mountain into an emergency shelter, a tradition, a community possession. Instead, she turned it into something else entirely, a fortress not only of steel and lumber but of calm endurance. And though her legal barrage would continue, by the end of that season it was already clear. Paper cannot shatter chain. The day of the court hearing arrived with none of the thunder and spectacle that had framed the stormy standoff at my gate. Instead, the sun hung politely over the courthouse, lighting halls that smelled faintly of dust and old paper, as if even the building understood that resolution was overdue. Karen arrived with her parents at her side, carrying folders thick with internet printouts, scribbled maps, and her own fierce conviction. She presented herself as guardian of a family legacy, cloaking her crusade in the language of heritage and moral obligation. My lawyer and I sat across the aisle, far less dramatic, armed with a binder heavy with actual deeds, surveys, county records, and inspector reports, dry, simple, irrefutable. The judge listened carefully, giving Karen her time to spin her version of events. She spoke of ancestral rights, how her parents had been caretakers of the old guest house, how tradition demanded it remain communal shelter. She gestured theatrically toward her parents, who looked pale and weary as if dragged to bear witness in a drama they barely understood. When my lawyer stood, there was no drama in his voice, just the reassuring cadence of fact. He laid out the chain of ownership, the surveyor's notes, the decades-long absence of any easement or right-of-way. He added copies of nuisance filings, inspector reports that cleared me, and the sheriff's own records. Fact by fact, stone by stone, the wall of reality rose higher until there was nothing left for her to climb. The judge closed the binder with an audible thud that echoed like final judgment. Looking at Karen over her glasses, she spoke words that fell heavy but soft. "This road and this property are not yours. The gavel's strike was almost gentle, but to me it sounded louder than any thunderstorm. In it was the sound of months of tension breaking, of sleepless nights, intrusive knocks, false notices, and public rumors, all collapsing beneath authority finally aligned with truth. Karen's parents looked startled, their expressions fractured between disbelief and dawning recognition. In the flicker of their eyes, I saw something of the truth reaching them at last, but it was impossible to know if it would ever outweigh Karen's narrative. The aftermath unfolded quietly but powerfully. My lawyer submitted an injunction immediately, a formal order barring Karen from further harassment, trespassing, or deceptive filings. By sunset that same day, the sheriff carried the official papers himself to the base of my road, handing me the crisp copy for my records with a brief smile. "You've handled this better than most," he told me. His words felt like a medal earned in a war I never asked for. Karen retreated, though not with grace. In the days that followed, I saw her car parked once at the bend in the road, headlights off, engine idling, gazing silently at the mountain she no longer had any foothold on. She didn't approach the gate. She just sat there, as though surveying a battlefield where she had lost too much to admit defeat. Eventually, the car rolled away and the ridge returned to its old rhythm. In her absence, life healed. Her parents sent me a handwritten letter of apology, shaky and brief but genuine. They admitted they had known little of the truth, that they had been brought along by their daughter's insistence, and were sorry to have been caught in the conflict. I read the letter twice, folded it into my files, and felt a small knot of bitterness loosen. They had been pawns in a story they never should have played in, and if resolution had spared them further humiliation, then it was enough. The mountain house itself seemed to breathe easier. With no more inspectors showing up unannounced, with no rumors battering me in town or contractors tugged away by threats, I could finally return to the work I had set out to do. The house was no longer just a fortress or barricade. It became a home. Trim was painted, floors polished, fireplaces stoked. The guest house, once the prized prize of Karen's obsession, stood completed. Warm with cedar and new glass, now not a communal shelter, but simply another room of my life, to be used when and how I chose. In town, the narrative shifted as quickly as clouds clearing from a ridge. People who had once heard Karen's side now paused to acknowledge mine. The county clerk who had warned me early of her filings congratulated me quietly that Karen's record at the courthouse was closed at last. Even the mail carrier seemed relieved, telling me, "No more crazy notes to deliver." The sheriff, passing me at a diner, nodded in casual solidarity. Where once I had been cast as stranger, now I was seen as the man who had endured Karen's crusade with patience and come out the other side holding ground firmly. With winter came true peace. Snow cloaked the cabin roofs and dusted the steel gate white, turning what once felt like a barricade into a sentinel resting under frost. The creek ran slower but still steady, and the light from the cabin windows glowed amber against the dark like a welcoming lantern. For the first time since I had arrived with a rented pickup, the mountain gave me what I had wanted most: silence uninterrupted by shouting or bureaucracy. And in that silence, I reflected on what the siege had given me: patience refined, a sharper instinct for boundaries, and the lesson that ownership is not just about paperwork or locks, but about the steadiness to defend one's place without losing oneself. Karen had thrown storms of paper and drama against me, but in the end it was endurance, quiet, methodical, almost stubborn, that had carried me through. The mountain house stood finished, both a retreat and a testament. Every reinforced beam and welded gate spoke of battles endured, yet every polished floor and warm fire whispered of a sanctuary reclaimed. Karen had vanished into the valley, a defeated echo. I remained with the ridge, the house, and at last the freedom to live the life I had envisioned when I first saw that crooked, "For sale by owner" sign. The story that had begun in siege ended in peace, and the mountain, indifferent and eternal, carried on as if it had always known this was how it would end.